ค่ะ
สวัสดีครับ
Welcome to Fertilizer podcast today. So today we are talking about soil health fertilizer use and the alternative to the chemical fertilizer. Thanks for joining us today, Titouan. Alright,
No
would you
problem.
introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Yes, I'm an intern at Ferragora and I worked on the regenerative agriculture document in link with my studies at engineer school in agronomy.
What are the components of the soil?
So the soil components are divided into three categories.
Three categories.
So you have the physical properties.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, it's how many sand, clay and silt you have. So that's called the texture of the soil.
Texture of the soil, the first one.
But you have other properties. You have like the water content and stuff like that. Then you have chemical properties.
Chemical carbon.
So it's, for example, nutrient concentrations. Or the most important for the soil life is pH. And the third component is the biological one. And that's where most often than not modern agriculture falls short, because traditionally during the agricultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s, and that which arrived a bit later on the South Asian, in the Southeast Asian countries, you tend to forget this biological component, whereas it can be really beneficial for cultures, and it's really related to how you manage your soil. For example, you have fungi. So you have a part around the root of the plant, which is called the rhizosphere, where the plant gives basically a sugar components from photosynthesis to microorganisms, and their roles are to protect the plants from pathogens. They can also increase the access to nutrients for the plant. And the other main example that we have of beneficial interactions between plants and the soil, microbial and fungi community is the mycorrhizae. So basically it's a symbiosis between the plants and fungi. And the fungi help the plant get new resources in exchange for sugar. In exchange, the plant gives them sugar from photosynthesis. Modern plants often do not have lost a part of this ability to do the symbiosis with mycorrhizae, but they still exist.
So back to the question.
Yeah.
The three components of the soil are
Physical, chemical, and biological.
okay. All right. Thank you. Question 2. What does modern agriculture impact soil erosion and why it is so important?
Okay, so modern agriculture, the main way it impacts soil erosion is that there is no permanent crop cover. So if you have a barren land during, if you're in Europe winter, or if you're in Thailand, after you harvest the sugarcane, if you don't leave anything on the soil and if you do not cultivate anything, you have a barren soil. What that means is that there is no protection for the soil. So if you have a big storm, if you have a lot of rain, your soil will be taken away by water, and you will actually lose soil. So at civilization time scale, it's a big threat to agriculture because soil forms very slowly and it erodes very rapidly.
Right.
And once it's lost, you cannot
Can't get it back.
Yeah, you can't get it back. One easy way to avert this is to have permanent soil cover. So whether it be mulch or cover crops, which can be very useful for animal feeding, for example, or you can also cultivate legumes to try to fix nitrogen in the soil. That will really help you. It's not very expensive to do, and it will make sense that your children and your grandchildren can still cultivate that same land.
If they add more plant, like those plant to fix the nitrogen, then it will be increasing the ability to capture the good nutrient into the soil, and then the plant will go better.
Yes. So it would have, like, if you cultivate legumes as cover crops, you have two benefits. Is that one, you protect the soil from erosion, and 2, you add nitrogen in your soil. If you leave the residues in the soil.
That's the way to have free fertilizer.
Yes,
through
kind
the,
of.
through the
Yeah.
usual agriculture practices. Alright. So the next question, what can we do to reduce the soil erosion?
Okay, so as we said, you can have permanent soil cover, but there are other ways to reduce soil erosion. So the second main way is to diversify your crop sequencing. So you can have intercropping, which is cultivating, for example, your sugarcane, 2 rows of sugarcane, and between each row you can plant other plants that will either fix nitrogen or plants that will compete with adventices. And diversifying what you plant in your soil will help with soil erosion. And the final practice that you can do to reduce soil erosion is to reduce tillage or eliminate it completely, because what tillage does is, so it removes weeds, obviously, but it also destroys all the biological porosity of the soil. So you create mechanical porosity because you're moving particles around and you're literally you're physically breaking the soil. So you're creating porosity, and which is good for the plants. But imagine a root, for example. So a root forms a pathway in the soil. Once the plant dies, this root will decompose and will leave behind a tunnel that leads from the surface to the bottom of the soil. So that is a natural highway for rainwater. So if you leave the soil without doing too much tillage, you will have a great increase in bioporosity, especially in the depth of the soil, and that will make it so if it rains, the water will be absorbed in the soil more easily. It won't create mudslides that will take away your soil. So if you have good biological porosity, you will not, your soil will be wet, but it won't be it won't be going away because of the water. You will also have aggregates of soil particles that will resist much better to rain.
Right. Okay, so to reduce soil erosion, intercropping, and do less tillage.
Yes, and diversify
the crop. Moving on to fertilizer, what are the issues with modern practices?
So the issue with fertilization practices today is mainly excessive nitrogen use.
Overuse of nitrogen in the farm.
Yeah. So this leads to acidic soils, which can be troublesome for the fungi and microbial communities.
Living in the soil, if it's too acidic, then they die, which is not good for the plant that would grow in the soil.
If you have aluminium in your soil and that the soil is acidic, the plants will take up the aluminium much better than in a neutral pH. It's not a nutrient that plants want, it's a poison. So if your soil is acidic and you have aluminium, you will not be able to cultivate most plants because they will just die. But what you can do to fix that is you can add calcium carbonate into the soil to re-establish a neutral pH, or you can just manage properly your own, because some soils are acidic from the start, but if it's because of nitrogen mismanagement, the best way to correct soil acidity is to have responsible nitrogen management practices.
How long does it take to slowly transfer the acidic soil into neutral soil?
I do not have a number of years in mind. If you want to do it very quickly, you put calcium in your soil, and this will re-establish pH back to normal. And then if the next year you have a good management practice for nitrogen, the problems will go away. So you can do it short term by putting together corrective action and long-term change.
Could you suggest an alternative to chemical fertilizer?
Yes, there are alternatives to chemical fertilizers. An easy thing to do to reduce chemical fertilizer is to manage properly your fertilization. through, for example, a software or through analysis of the soil. And what you can do to further reduce the use of nitrogen is add organic fertilizer on top of your chemical fertilizer. And you can also cultivate legumes as intercrops or cover crops, because they will fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil for your plants.
Can you suggest some alternative products to help the farmer put together the chemical fertilizer and organic fertilizer? What are the suggestions on the material to be used?
So for the sugarcane industry, the very good thing is that you have a lot of the byproducts of sugar production by the mills are actually really good organic fertilizer. So the first one that comes to mind is the filter cake. So it's basically what you get after you've extracted all the sugar from the stalk. And it has good contents of phosphorus and nitrogen and very low sugar content. So it can be used quite effectively as organic fertilizer. You also have vinasse, which is also a byproduct, which is pretty good. And if you have cattle, pigs, or chickens, for example, you can also use manure. So all organic fertilizer will behave differently because they release nitrogen at a slower pace than chemical fertilizer. So if you put urea, so the most common chemical fertilizer, the 4600, it will release the nitrogen very quickly in the soil because it's readily accessible to plants, but they will inevitably lose a big fraction of this nitrogen, and it will leach into groundwater, and it can pose problems for threat to the human health and the environment. Whereas with organic fertilizer, the release of nitrogen is much slower, it's much more regular. So during the first year, you can have 60% of the nitrogen because it's decomposed, because it's with carbon compounds, and it's accessible to your plants. During the second year, there may be 30%, and the last year, 10% of the nitrogen that is released. So if you want to have something that releases quite quickly, you want to go for liquid organic fertilizer, such as vinasse and pig's wine, for example. But you have to beware because it can cause environmental pollution, just like chemical fertilizer. So you have to manage it carefully. And if you want to go for a fertilizer that are good for the structure of the soil and release their compounds a bit more slowly, you want to go for filter cake or compost or for cattle manure. So that's it, the different types of fertilizer you can use.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you so much for today.
Thank you very much for listening to this podcast. It was Ferragora and see you soon.